Did Metroid Prime Remastered flop? And what impact has the fate of that game had on Nintendo's thinking around Metroid Prime 4 Beyond? In my deep dive on the Nintendo investor presentation recently, I noted that we could infer some game sales numbers from their franchise-specific roundups. One game I didn't do the maths on, but which regular commenter Minecraft3448 did, was Metroid Prime Remastered. Sadly, with 4.99 million units sold on Switch from the Metroid franchise and 3.07 million copies sold of Metroid Dread as of December 2022, we can confirm that Metroid Prime Remastered certainly sold less than 2 million copies so far, and probably closer to 1.5. There is no way around it. The gorgeous and critically acclaimed remaster of the legendary GameCube classic did not even hit the 2 million mark that Shigeru Miyamoto himself has said is the aspiration for most Nintendo games to be considered a success. Now, Metroid has never been a high-selling franchise, but after the relative success of Metroid Dread, and being the first Prime title to grace the Switch, whose famed Switch effect has rocketed almost every property on the system to previously unseen sales heights, it's a bitter blow to think that such an absolute gem of a game couldn't, with over a year on the market, cross a relatively modest sales threshold. And it's not like Nintendo did nothing to push its numbers up. Granted, its launch was not exactly all guns blazing. It was a shadow drop in the February 2023 Nintendo Direct, and in the middle of the presentation at that, rather than being accorded the first slot or the coveted one more thing segment. Furthermore, it appeared in a time that was absolutely flush with incredible titles. Fire Emblem Engage had just launched, Kirby Return to Dreamland Deluxe was only just dropping, and the forthcoming months were packed with Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and Pikmin 4, all major core audience titles. But the shadow drop strategy did seem to make some kind of sense for a fan-favourite niche game. I'm sure there were people who double-dipped purely as a result of this release strategy, purchasing the digital copy at the shadow drop launch and then coming back for a physical edition for posterity thereafter. And the price tag was appropriate for doing this. A nice and cool $40 made it a third less than most top-tier Switch games, and barely more than half the price of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. If anybody had an excuse not to pick up Metroid Prime Remastered, price was not one of those reasons. They also did give it a few trailers after its launch, including an accolades trailer to celebrate its qualities. In Japan, where Metroid has always struggled compared to other Nintendo franchises, they launched a more than 4-minute long trailer alongside the Nintendo Direct to showcase to Japanese gamers the strengths of the Metroid Prime series. Evidently, though, this did not correspond to outsized sales. Now, perhaps Metroid Prime is not so far removed from the kind of sales other games have achieved. Fire Emblem Engage, despite being a real favourite of mine for its tighter focus on tactics and brighter aesthetic compared to Three Houses, clearly underperformed next to its predecessor. And another GameCube port, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, was announced to delirious acclaim from long-term fans, and yet relatively tepid sales figures compared to Paper Mario The Origami King and the previous year's Super Mario RPG. We talk about the Switch effect, but perhaps what held true for the height of the system, where there were legions of players desperate to try new things, has now dissipated in an era when we are getting second and third iterations of franchises on the console. Nintendo advised Ubisoft once to wait for a new console to release Sparks of Hope. Ubisoft ignored them to their peril and seemingly only managed to Apollo 13 Sparks of Hope sales numbers through their usual strategy of hyper-aggressive price cuts. That Metroid Dread was as successful as it seems to have been was already miraculous. Over 3 million for a 2D Metroid is truly incredible, but then that was still sold at the height of the system, and indeed launched alongside the Switch OLED model and was advertised heavily in the OLED's trailers, not least because it was an absolutely ideal game to demonstrate the capacity of the OLED screen to render deep blacks of the sort found in the kinds of eerie subterranean depths Samus would be exploring. But perhaps we were looking at this through the wrong end of the telescope. Metroid Dread benefited hugely from being the launch game for the Switch OLED model, if only because it arrived in a shower of publicity. But did the Switch OLED benefit in turn? I don't think it was to the system's massive detriment, having Metroid Dread as its accompanying launch game, since their first audience was primarily people upgrading from the original Switch, and those people were liable to be the kinds of more hardcore players who might give a title like Metroid Dread a tilt, and the 2021 holiday season was flush with the more commercial heavyweight titles, such as Mario Party Superstars and Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Plus, of course, the system by that point had many great evergreens for newer fans. Even the new Mario game earlier that year, Bowser's Fury, had a darker kind of aesthetic that was probably quite flattering for the OLED screen. Still, when you consider that Link's Awakening shifted 3.13 million in its first quarter on sale, a quarter in which it only had 11 days on the market, but it did accompany the Switch Lite, perhaps Metroid Dread's achievement isn't all that great. Yes, Zelda is a popular franchise, but 2D Zelda has never been all that popular, and this was in 2019, before the Switch install base had exploded during the pandemic. Plus, Link's Awakening was a remake of a game that many dedicated Nintendo fans had been able to play on recent systems, including the 3DS, which was being sold at the time. I'm not saying that Zelda Link's Awakening didn't have higher sales expectations than Metroid Dread. I just wonder whether Nintendo hoped putting Samus so front and centre could yield better results than it did. In this sense, it's possible to see the 1-2 punch of the Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime Remastered launches as kind of a compare and contrast experiment. Two games of the same franchise, both games of extremely high quality with the same loyal fan base, and yet the releases are pretty much the complete opposite. Metroid Dread was trailed intensively for months and launched in pretty much the highest profile slot on the calendar that holiday season, as it was alongside hardware. Metroid Prime Remastered was shadow dropped and given almost nothing to push it. Come what may, you could make the case that the Metroid Prime Remastered numbers gives us a lower tramline for what a Metroid game can do on a relatively successful console, and also gives us an idea of the proportion of people that were converted from Dread newbies to Samus devotees. We can even put numbers to it. Let's assume, therefore, that the ratio of Dread sales to Remastered sales was roughly 2-1. That seems plausible if we think that Dread had 3.3 million sales and Metroid Prime Remastered 1.65 million, and in any event, this makes the maths easier. Basically, all that hype doubled the sales of Metroid. Now, we can't completely rule out that there were other issues Prime faced. Although a very different style of Metroid title, it was still a Metroid title, and therefore suffered the same fate that many second games on a system faced. Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is still stumbling around with less than 2/3 of the sales of Breath of the Wild after all, despite having a very high profile initial launch, and Engage at 1.61 million, as last reported, seems to have managed less than half of the numbers of Three Houses, which has crossed 4.12 million. In this sense, the Metroid Prime Remastered drop-off is proportionately in the average range. But of course, none of these games had the huge advantage that Remastered had in terms of price, or it was probably an advantage anyway. There is always a risk with price that lowering the price appears to communicate a lowering of quality as well. And while I don't think that was the case, it is possible that some casual fans saw a $40 Metroid Prime title and made a negative inference. Nevertheless, all things being equal, one would expect lowering the price to increase the sell-through of a game. This also creates a huge problem for Remastered's reception by Nintendo, because ultimately, while sales figures are great to demonstrate market penetration and to potentially capture more fans, the success of a game purely on its own terms, and I'll deal with the broader terms of the metrics of success later, but let's just stick to its own terms for now, has to be in terms of cold, hard sales, and dropping the price from $60 to $40 would actually have had a proportionately greater impact on the title's profitability than the headline figures might suggest. After all, many games have fixed costs from cartridge production to distribution to essential marketing, and obviously all the overheads that are associated with any game development. Again, I will consider costs specific to Remastered in a moment. What this means is that the $20 drop was coming from the game's margins, some of which would have accrued to the retailer, but much of which would have been to the direct cost of Nintendo. So, if it sold half as many copies, and also its margins were potentially half as high, Remastered could be making a quarter of the profits of Metroid Dread, even assuming the development costs were equal. But they probably weren't equal. Metroid Dread was developed from the ground up for the Switch, and we can reasonably assume that it took somewhere in the region of 3 to 4 years to make. Nintendo likes games ready in good time, and it's quite possible that the pandemic led to some delays, but it was clearly started fairly soon after Mercury Steam wrapped up Metroid Samus Returns on 3DS, which shipped in September 2017. Remastered's provenance is a lot more murky. There have been lots of rumours about Retro Studios' activities after they delivered Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze on Wii U in the beginning of 2014, but apart from the Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze port in 2018 on Switch, and the fact that Shinya Takahashi said himself in January 2019 that Retro had been put onto Metroid Prime 4, we know very little about their activities over the last decade. The rumour mill would have us believe that they had a cancelled game and then were developing a remake of Metroid Prime after, but this got pushed to the back burner when Metroid Prime 4 came along. But then again, the rumour mill would also have us believe that you were able to play Star Fox Racing on the Switch Pro by now. This interpretation of Retro's recent history certainly sounds like plausible guesswork, but I've never been able to substantiate any of this with hard facts, given that Metroid Prime already existed on the GameCube and that this game was essentially a remaster, a gorgeous and full-throated remaster that many felt deserved to be called a remake, but a remaster nevertheless. This should have been a less costly to develop title than Metroid Dread, and it's also possible that it could have been used as a way to ameliorate the costs of Metroid Prime 4's developments by recouping some of the spend on assets and engine development that would otherwise have to wait another 2 years until Beyond launched. At least I really hope that's the case, because if we just take the credits on face value, Metroid Prime Remastered had 420 separate people or support organisations credited. Metroid Dread had 223. Not only did Metroid Prime Remastered have half the sales, and potentially as little as half the margins of Metroid Dread, it also had half the number of people involved. Let's not panic too much though, credits don't tell the whole story. Mercury Steam is a cohesive group of people, and a very large group of theirs were working solidly on Dread for a long period. Retro Studios clearly brought in people to help, and if you're hiring people to help anyway, it makes as much sense to hire a large number of people for a short time as a smaller number for a longer period. Wages assumed to be equal, 200 people being hired for 4 years would cost the same as 400 people being hired for 2 years. Still, whatever else Metroid Prime Remastered may be, nobody can say it was cheap. Now, Metroid Prime Remastered may not quite be ready to tread the light fantastic just yet. For one thing, when Metroid Prime 4 Beyond does finally release, it feels to me at least 50% certain that there will be a Switch successor version, if only in the form of a free upgrade. After all, why launch an expensive, long in development, graphical showcase game on a system where everybody who cares about graphics in a big way will be migrating away? At that point, the interest around Metroid Prime, and surely the promotion, will be such that Nintendo may be able to upsell the remastered game as well to people who are interested in Beyond. Now, generally Nintendo doesn't like to do this. Their one game per console approach would mitigate against them having 2 competing versions of games at once. But this is a different case. Beyond will not have a huge player base, but it will have a short time of being in the sun. So if they can tempt people to try Remastered off the back of the Beyond hype, it could work well for them. Nintendo acted in a vaguely similar way with Pikmin 4, where they also had Pikmin 3 Deluxe out, and they announced Pikmin 1 and 2 in the run-up to Pikmin 4. Even better, at least graphically, is if Beyond was a Switch successor exclusive, but having Nintendo shown a trailer for Beyond with a massive clicky Switch logo at the front, it seems impossible to imagine that Nintendo would backtrack on that, so 90% it will come to the base Switch as well, or even exclusively. Another open question, though, is Metroid Prime 2 and 3. My dream would be to have these games remastered and playable in all their glory. Heartbreakingly, this now feels very unlikely to me. Even if they charge $60 each, even $70 on the next system for remastered or even fully remade editions, it's hard to believe that the less well-regarded second entry would outperform the original in numbers, and it would still presumably cost Nintendo a lot to redevelop, even if they leaned on the first remastered title for assets. I hope we're wrong, but I think a top whack of probably 70% chance we are due a Pikmin 1+2 style double pack, which, while understandable, still seems like such a pity given the quality of the Metroid Prime titles. I'm not completely without hope. Nintendo sees these things as ultra long-term investments, and the blunt fact is that a remastered version with better controls and graphics that can be upscaled more easily has a much higher chance of being sold and resold in perpetuity than a GameCube title, which would really only end up as being a footnote in the massive list of Nintendo Switch Online games once that service finally adds GameCube titles to the mix. Nintendo, remember, has other data from over the years, including how well these games have or haven't sold on Virtual Console back in the day, so they can probably hazard a reasonable guess as to how many Metroid Prime players will migrate to the sequel games. If they can find a way to budget tightly, even if remasters only make a small profit, these would at least mean that Metroid, if it ever does become a major award-winning breakout success through a motion picture or what have you, would have amazing versions of these games that would be at Nintendo's disposal. As for me, I would love full remakes, but I have to say I just don't see them as being especially likely. But there is so much still to be seen about how Metroid Prime 4 Beyond will be positioned. They've done the big system launching Metroid, and they've done the shadow drop cheapy advertising strategy, and now we will have to see how they will launch Metroid Prime 4. In many ways, the game seems to be a retread of the kind of strategy we saw with Bayonetta 3, an early and possibly too early hype-building reveal near the beginning of the console's life, a long wait for the first trailer, but then a release the following year. Bayonetta 3 dropped in October 2022, a rather choice, or should I say prime, holiday spot, but launching between Splatoon 3 and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Nintendo could afford, and probably flat out wanted, a lower key, more niche offering for this competitive window. In this case, Metroid Prime 4 could prove to be a very powerful game to launch alongside something more major like Mario Kart, for example. There is no way it would compete with Mario Kart, but as a statement of intent for the new console, these two games would definitely show tremendous diversity in terms of Nintendo's offer to new players. Ultimately, I don't think the seeming lack of success of Remastered will deter Nintendo from pushing Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. After all, they've bet heavily on Beyond, and they will really need to stick the course. It may make sense for them to be more cautious about backing a direct sequel to Beyond, though, or at least one on the same console. And if Retro Studios were to move to another major project, as would seem likely to be doing even before Prime releases, a 3D Donkey Kong, let's say, then even if Beyond is successful, even if it's hugely successful, we could still be looking at over a decade for a fifth Prime title, at least assuming that these games continue to take around 5 to 6 years to make, as seems to have been Retro Studios' current development. For more on Metroid, I do have a deep dive from earlier in the year floating onto the screen on how Nintendo could potentially make this wonderful franchise hit the big time. Thank you to this channel's Patreon members, and please do like, share, subscribe and comment. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.